Connecticut has a distinct and unique political philosophy. It is similar to the framework of the viewpoint of the second John Locke. I am going to make the argument that Connecticut foundational structures are best understood as similar to those held in the lesser-known views of John Locke. The interrelations caused by Connecticut's foundational apartheid are ignored. They don't teach us much about the state's political and economic development. But, yes, perhaps you're thinking, I have heard about Locke. His work is pretty famous. He represents the Enlightenment, the Age of Revolution. He believed people had natural rights and they were created equal. But I am not talking about that view or about belief men were created equal. I am not talking about the democratic viewpoint which Jefferson had adopted from Locke and put into the Constitution. There's a second John Locke, one which did not regard all men as created equal. What's typically unsaid, however, at least in the Connecticut narrative, is that Locke's actions showed he had an inconsistent belief in the equality of men. Locke was an incorporator and owner of the African Slave Society, which was the major importer of slaves to America, and he wrote the North Carolina Charter, which structured slavery there. He wrote in 1668, not in the Enlightened century. And Locke's theory of property, including human property, can provide a useful framework for understanding Connecticut's period of apartheid rule. This period before the Civil War did not have a social contract predicated upon social or political inclusion. Since a goal of the state was to protect property, this period framed key financial and political structures and provided separate legal frameworks for whites and for non-whites. This social contract is summarized in the Gradual Emancipation Act of 1784, in which the English of Connecticut showed their commitment after the Declaration of Independence to retain as much of their privileged status and property rights as they could. The act declared slavery was only to be modified. It emphasized protection of a property right over humans. Slavery was only to be abolished after the age of 25 and only for people born after its passage. The act explicitly recognized human inequality in its preamble when it declared Connecticut's protection of property and humans was
consistent with the rights of individuals and the public safety and welfare.
Connecticut's history explains why and how it is not a revolutionary product of 1776. It shows Connecticut just isn't like Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, we all know of the colonists who revolted against the English. They dressed up as the Native Americans. And they did so because the Native Americans to them in Massachusetts were the people on the outs, the noble and the free people. The Massachusetts colonists defined themselves as people squaring off and seeking liberation from another group, one living in a different place, in England, and one which controlled them. The Connecticut settlers, on the other hand, massacred the dominant Indian tribe. They began as independent. They began as a group who were there to rule over the inhabitants. They were there to clear the land. Right here, what you see is the previously forested massacre site. The English of Connecticut farmed the land, and that group was to exercise domination over it and over its people. Connecticut leaders saw themselves as a separate group which had the right to rule over all inhabitants. In all their foundational documents, such as the Founders' Orders, they referred to themselves not as colonial subjects, but as the English of Connecticut. In fact, the Founders' Orders makes no mention of royal authority or the king. It states that God has given them the right to settle and control Connecticut. Yes, they sought permission of the English king to rule Connecticut, and their attitude seemingly was one of obedience to their king. But Connecticut's situation is unlike that in which the king claimed ownership and then decided who he wanted to rule over his property. Connecticut's claim was based upon the settlers' own actions and their own choices. It is notable, the English of Connecticut sent the personal narrative of their acts, written by their military leader, Mason, to the king, and this would have proven it was their acts which had resulted in the conquest. Although not expressly stated ultimately, Connecticut claimed the right to rule because their personal actions in the conquest resulted in control and sovereignty. During the 1600s, Connecticut leaders dealt with a society in England which experienced a restoration of the king's rule. The fanciful legend of the hiding of the Charter Oak reveals the basic Connecticut relationship to the English crown. In 1687, King James sent Edmund Andros to the state to give up the original charter and require a return to English rule. What happened when Andros arrived is the subject of the Charter Oak legend, and like all legends, it tells us what the creators of the story thought about their own selves and their own situation. Andros met with the English of Connecticut and debated strongly and at length with them. At one point, the candles in the room all went out, and Joseph Wadsworth took the charter and hid it in the Charter Oak. Thus, the legend goes, the good people of Connecticut were saved by their clever leaders and remained in complete control of their independent political situation. John Locke's major work was published not in the Age of Enlightenment, but in 1689. John Locke's views describing democracy for leadership within an apartheid state resulted from his personal experiences. Locke first attended school within walking distance of the event in which King Charles was decapitated on January 31st, 1649. And this event, perhaps more than any other event, made a lasting impression on the young John Locke, and actually on the whole of political philosophy. Think about it. If the king's rule was not ordained by God, what then was the moral basis for any government? How could there be any effective higher reason to prevent anarchy? In England, the king's execution produced a very bloody civil war between those who supported the Parliament and those who supported the king and his divine right to rule. And Locke saw and was deeply disturbed by the killing and disorder the war produced. This same conflict was formative in Connecticut. As Locke was growing up, the tide turned against the parliamentarians who had ordered the king's execution, and its leaders often fled to Connecticut, which valued their political views. In New Haven, you can visit the Three Judges Cave and see where the judges who executed King Charles hid. And when you stand in the center of the city, you stand on the corner of its main streets, Dixwell, Whaley, and Gough, named for these three regicide judges who hid in this city for years with those who supported the parliamentary system. Connecticut has towns such as Cromwell, named after the parliamentarian military leader. And in 1639, the state adopted an anti-authoritarian No King's Bill of Rights, which proclaimed and prioritized the settlers' beliefs issued by the Connecticut legislature, spelled out the settlers' individual rights. Think about the scope and the passion of this statement of rights. The very first act of the Connecticut legislature of our founding fathers shown here on our state capitol. They say no one can be arrested unless a properly enacted law is broken. The executive cannot even use its power to control speech over the enfranchised minority called the English of Connecticut. And the enfranchised few made it clear that only the legislature has the power to tax, a power which includes the right to impose a tariff. The act stated,
"No man's life shall be taken away, no man's name shall be stained, no man's person shall be arrested, or in any way punished, or in any way damaged, unless it be by the virtue or equity of some express law, established by a general corte after sufficient publication."
What then does the second John Locke teach us? First, it indicates a different narrative, one of an apartheid society within what we think of as Connecticut history. And second, it asks us to discover whether that narrative better explains the major events and central dynamics of that history. If you take as an example of a major event the Battle of Fort Griswold in New London, we often find there is a narrative of a battle of Americans against foreign colonialists, the Redcoats. The Americans are led by Colonel Ledyard, whose actions are truly heroic. And sometimes there's also narrative of the battle in which important ethnic leaders participate as notable actors. In this particular battle, we find there are Native Americans, such as the Pequot Tom Wansek, who's severely wounded, and there is Major Montgomery, who leads the British troops in the final charge up the ramparts of the fort, and there's an African American, James Freedman. he kills Montgomery at a known spot. On occasion, there is a suggestion that the battle is best viewed as a common effort of diverse groups and people united in a new revolutionary government brought together by its constitution. But at the top of Fort Griswold, you see the lone memorial there. Its purpose is to explain what went on in that specific location. The memorial pictures Major Montgomery, who was killed at that spot where the British troops he led had reached the place where they could overwhelm the Americans. What needs to be brought out and explained is that there is no mention on this plaque of the guy who killed him, James Friedman. After all, Friedman is our man. His unmentioned identity, his courageous actions, and his relationship to Colonel Ledyard are the most important takeaways from a visit to Fort Griswold. If this scene were in a war movie, Friedman would be our hero who discovers the evil enemy who is killing our guys, and Friedman would lead the group which overpowers him. Friedman is the indispensable sergeant, and sergeants win battles. More broadly, the reason a study of Connecticut in its apartheid period is important is that history must explain why and how Connecticut achieved the financial success it did. Why did it have individuals exercising the needed initiatives? Who were the sergeants, the Friedmans? It needs to be kept in mind that Connecticut grew to be the largest importer of sugar and molasses in the world. Fort Griswold's leader, Colonel Ledyard, and his circle owned many ships which were harbored upriver from the fort. Connecticut ships traveled the world, and this required the coordinated labor and initiative of many individuals. And Connecticut's economic development involved both initiative and particularly complex processes. The state's money was not made harvesting a single crop with a large labor force. What could require more individual initiative than shipbuilding, maritime commerce, whaling, manufacture, and farming? Connecticut was called the provision state because its efficient farmers produced goods for export to other states and lands. And every single one of these financial success stories is powered by many can-do people. John Locke may not have decided which side he was on, but Connecticut's legal system did. All inhabitants were not equal. This commitment to inequality can be traced back to Connecticut's foundational documents, the Founders' Orders, and the Treaty of Hartford, which established the framework for control of all non-white inhabitants. Apartheid continued long after the Declaration of Independence declared all men were created equal. As we have just seen, the Gradual Emancipation Act of 1784 explicitly allowed slavery in some situations, and in 1831, New Haven voted down a college for non-whites by a vote of 700 to 4. The lopsided nature of this vote evidences established consensus among the enfranchised. New Haven was a small community in which people lived near each other and very often interacted. We should ask what this event can tell us about Connecticut history. Studies of apartheid in South Africa and Ireland have shown the elites often shared a widely held fear of systemic breakup. They thought, there goes my everything. Later in 1834, a proposal for a non-white girls' school was opposed by the Canterbury citizens in Connecticut, and as a result, the Connecticut legislature passed law allowing the town to veto the project. The Connecticut Supreme Court was asked to decide whether the federal constitution required allowance of the school. The state Supreme Court recognized the issue as being whether the privileges and immunities provision of the federal constitution required non-whites to be treated as citizens of Connecticut. It allowed full debate from the leading proponents on the profound issue. It considered Connecticut's legal history of human rights, one which went back to the Magna Carta and even to classical times. And then, perhaps not unsurprisingly, the court concluded it was impotent to decide this issue. The very issue raised, as we have seen, by the two John Lockes. Perhaps we should admit Locke was right on one point. Either you believe all men are created equal or you do not. You cannot have it both ways. And once the state accepts, it can arrest its inhabitants arbitrarily, depending only upon its ruler's preferences, many bad things will happen. Copyright 2025 Peter A. Trevors, P.O. Box 3395, 16 Eunice George Drive, Mashantucket, CT 06338.